Okay, take a look at page 37 of today's daily newspaper, The Punch. This is what the part of what the former Vice Chancellor of the University of Lagos, Professor Oye Ibidapo, has to say about education funding in Nigeria. He says, quote, there cannot be good leadership without sound education for people that will form the government. As such, there should be more investment in education. Well-meaning Nigerians should come to the aid of the government. That's part of what he said. He told the newspapers in an interview published today. So education economics is very important. And why is this very important? We have a very interesting interview with Professor Uche Uwaleke, who is of the Nasarawa State University, is joining us live from our Abuja studios. He's a professor of capital market and is also a development economist. Thank you very much, Professor. It's good to have you here this morning. I hope you heard what Professor Ibidapo Obey said there about education funding. But first, let's get your views about when we look at education in our policy mix. Look at the GDP numbers for 2018, third quarter. Education was contracted 0.42%. So even in education, we're now growing education as a part of our GDP basket. Take it from here.
Yeah, well, compliments of the season, Boston, and compliments of the season to our viewers. The MBS report just cited and not only talked about the the fact that education is still in the negative territory at 0.42%. That the contribution of education to GDP was just about in the third quarter of 2018 just about 2%. And of course, that is linked to funding. And I very much agree with what the submission of Professor Obey with regard to more funding, more attention to education, because it's a key component of human capital development. Now, if you look at the allocations to education sector over the years, it leaves much to be desired. Take for example the 2018 budget. In the 2018 budget, education got about a little over 600 billion, with the recurrent spending at about 500 billion. So capital in 2018 budget is about 100 billion. Now, you look at the 2019 budget proposal that has just been presented before the National Assembly. We also noticed a drop, even in absolute terms. The capital spend is just 47 billion, as opposed to 100 billion we had in 2018. And of course, that even the capital component, when it comes to implementation, because that's the worrisome aspect of it, the capital component is also, when it comes to implementation, not much is done in that area. By the time you have a mega amount allocated to capital and you still don't even do up to 80–90% of it, you can imagine what the outcomes will be. So allocation to education is very key. And if you look at peer countries, you also discover that Nigeria lags behind in terms of
Professor Uwaleke.
In education.
Professor Uwaleke, we will get a little bit. Professor Mia, cut in here very quickly. We will get to that funding. And I want us to just push our viewers to understand the level of education's contribution to the GDP and where we're coming from. So I'm going to ask you to take a look at this on your TV screen, the table we had earlier from NBS, and we're trying to roll that up. And if we just scroll that up a little bit, folks, in production, just scroll that up a little bit and hang it there. You see, over the last few quarters, 2017 looks like a very negative year for education. If we scroll that page up a little bit, folks, can you do that very quickly? And then we just, if you roll it up a bit, then you find that chart there. You find out that education GDP was about 0.8% growth in the first quarter of last year. But if you look at the second quarter, third quarter, and fourth quarter of last year, education actually went down from about 1.34%, 1.22%, 1.04%, then went up to about 0.45%, then it started coming down again. So, Professor, I'm sure that's a little bit very faint there. I'm not too sure you're able to see that. We apologize. So, let's get back to you. That's just a picture I'm trying to paint, that last year didn't really look good in terms of education's contribution to the GDP. But it looks like in the first quarter of this year, that moved sharply up to about 0.5%. Then it's coming down all over again in the second quarter. And now the third quarter is a little bit lower than the second quarter. So what do you think we're doing in the education sector? When we say education is contributing to the GDP, what does it really mean? What does the education system, sector have to contribute to the GDP? Is it the JAM fees? Is it the WAEC fees? What exactly is it?
Of course, you know, if you look at the methodology of MBS, it says GDP is gross output minus intermediate production, consumption. And for sectors like manufacturing, it's very easy to, to measure. You look at the prices of goods, and for example, and then you subtract, cost of purchasing raw materials, and other, expenses. So it is easy to determine, with respect to certain sectors. But when it comes to education, it's not as easy to do that. And that's because for public education, for example, is not easy to measure, as opposed to what you have with respect to private education, where fees, for example, are market-driven. People pay economic fees. And that's why, if you look at the methodology of MBS, it talks about government production and private production. So for government production, it only tries to estimate, such contributions. Because as I said, one way you can measure the contribution of education to GDP is to look at, if you're looking at gross output, you're looking at the revenues that these institutions, are getting. And then, of course, you try to subtract, the cost of these institutions to really get the contributions. So for public schools, it's not really easy. You can only, estimate. But funding of these institutions, particularly public institutions,
Professor, we'll get to
is
funding
critical.
quickly.